Welcome to Bloodstained Backstories, where we dive into some of the most shocking and tragic cases of crime from all around the world. I'm your host Jace, and in this episode, we are going to discuss a case that remains haunting for many this day, and this is two murders of two young children by their mother, Susan Smith. In 1994, Susan Smith's story captivated the nation as a tale of heartbreak, deception, and betrayal. In the case, it raised questions about the lengths someone will go to for personal gain and the disturbing consequences of those actions. Before we get into the details of the crime itself, let's take a moment to understand Susan Smith's background. She was born on September 26, 1971 in a small town of Union, South Carolina, where she grew up in a relatively small family, but it was a family that was used to tragic heartbreak and emotional instability. Susan's father committed suicide when she was 6 years old. Susan herself attempted suicide when she was 13. Her mother remarried, and the man she remarried was accused of molesting Susan when she was a teenager. The relationship between Susan and the new husband, Russell, continued for a long time, up to 6 months before the murders. After she graduated high school in 1989, Susan made another attempt to commit suicide. Eventually, she marries and has two children, Michael, who is 3 years old at the time of the murder, and Alex, who was 1 year old at the time of the murder. Now, let's fast forward to October 1994. On the evening of October 25th, Susan calls 911 claiming that her car had been hijacked by an African-American man while she was at a stoplight. She said her two sons, Michael and Alex, were in the car when it was taken. In the 911 call, she is visibly distraught, and you can hear the trembling of her voice and the emotions in it. In the call, Susan told the authorities that the man had threatened her with a gun and driven off with the children in the vehicle. Local police, along with the FBI, launched a massive search for the children. News outlets all across the country picked up the story, and for days, Susan appeared on TV pleading for the safe return of her sons. Her tearful interviews and public calls for help were made her a very sympathetic figure, at least initially. But something didn't quite sit right with the investigators. As the investigation unfolded, detectives began to notice inconsistencies in her story, and some of the timeline of events didn't add up either, and the details kept shifting around or changing as she talked to different people throughout this time. Her behavior also began to be very suspicious too. On the 911 call, she was very upset, very distraught. When police showed up, she was very upset, visibly distraught. But throughout this time, the interviews, she was very calm, and in subsequent interviews with police, she was very calm and cool and collected, which is not what you would expect to see. On November 3rd, 1994, just a week after the children were reported missing, Susan admitted the unthinkable. She had intentionally driven her car into John D. Long Lake, which was a remote area near her home, and the two children were left strapped in the car. She told authorities that she had let the car sink, drowning the body of the two sons. She hesitated several times. With the car in neutral, she eventually pushed it into the lake. Very slowly, the car entered the water and the children drowned. When the dive team began to look for the vehicle and the children, they eventually located it. The visibility was extremely poor, and when they got to the car, the dive team reported that the children had been floating upside down towards the roof of the car, and one of the children had their hand reached out, touching the window, as if it was asking and trying to get help, even in the moments that it took their last breath. Why did Susan do this? Why would she kill her two children? According to her, she was very desperate to be in this relationship with a new man whose name was David Smith, not her husband. The last name is just a coincidence. But she wanted to marry David, and David made it very clear he wanted nothing to do with children and Susan's children. So to have a relationship with this man, she felt she had no other choice but to murder her children. After her confession, she was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder, and during the trial, her defense team argued that she was suffering from depression and emotional distress at the time of the killing, trying to suggest that she was not fully in control of her actions. However, the prosecution argued that Susan Smith was a calculated and cold-hearted in her decision for ending her children's lives. And the fact that she hesitated, and of all the ways to murder people and her children, she decided to leave them in her car and put the car in neutral and push the car into a lake, kind of shows a little bit of premeditation, not a freak accident, not a way of determining that it happened differently. Susan also came up with a story and led people to believe for many days that they're missing. She came up with the story of the carjacking of a African American man, all which show premeditation and some forethought. That's not something you're going to just come up with on the fly. On July 22nd, 1995, Susan was convicted of 2 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. This is a case that shook the nation, leaving many questions of how a mother could do such a horrific thing to children, to her own children. The lead prosecutor in the case tried to ask for Susan to have the death penalty, but the jury did not agree, and they unanimously voted to not give her the death penalty. While she was in prison, she was incarcerated in the Camille Griffin Graham Correctional Institute in Columbia, South Carolina. Now, while in prison, she had multiple internal punishments for sexual interactions with the correctional officers. She also had a drug sentence charge while she was serving her life sentence. In 2000, 2 correctional officers were charged with having sex with her, and that resulted in her being moved to Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood. Susan tried to file for parole in November of 2024, and she was denied at that time. Now, Susan had served 30 years at this point of her sentence when she tried to get parole and was denied. And now that she's been in prison for at least 30 years, she is eligible to be up for parole every 2 years moving forward. Hopefully, she will never be paroled. Her actions are unexcusable. The lives that these 2 children have, we will never know. We will never know if these 2 children will come up with some of the most groundbreaking, earth-shattering things that would have done so many great things for people. These 2 boys had such a life to live, and it was taken from them so quickly. Thank you for joining us on this episode. The story of Susan Smith is one that continues to haunt many to this day. If you would like to learn more about this case or hear more deep dives about other true crime stories, be sure to subscribe to our podcast and listen to us anywhere that you listen to podcasts. And also, leave us some comments. We love to engage with our viewers in the comments, so let us know what your thoughts are about this tragic case, the sentencing, the appeal. And until next time, stay safe, and remember that the truth is often stranger and more tragic than fiction.